Gonna be a big event, I'm sure.
Yeah, we do it every year. It's the Puget Sound Bonsai Club's annual fundraiser. So we host it, but it's their event, and we get a pretty good turnout from people in Oregon, down in Portland, come up, and all over Washington. So it's kind of the only real regional auction that exists up here. So yeah, it should be a fun, brings the bonsai folks out to the museum.
Yeah, I always check out the whatever images or video comes out of that because there's often some really fun material in there.
Yeah, yeah. It ebbs and flows. You never know what you're gonna get, so you kind of have to show up to see it in person. So yeah, that's what's going on. But yeah, I'm at home, and hopefully you can hear me okay.
It actually sounds
This is
great.
what.
Yeah,
Okay, good,
so
good
no
enough.
problem at all there. Yeah. So how's the show been going?
It's been going great. I'm really happy to have it up, and as you know, producing exhibitions, it's a lot of work, and so once it's done or up, you're kind of like, okay, that I'm glad to see it on the wall and up. So it's been going great, and we're excited to see kind of how things progress over the next 2 to 4 weeks as the World Cup starts up here in a couple weeks, because that was largely the inspiration for the idea. The kernel of the idea was kind of tapping into the idea of the World Cup as a a reference for the design of the exhibition.
People are thinking globally, and what a perfect opportunity to look at global influences on our trees.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we'll see as we, who knows what it's going to look like, as the travel and all of those things that are out of our control kind of are different than they were a year ago. But so yeah, we'll curious to see kind of what the turnout looks like in our region for that.
That'll be really fun. What I was thinking it'd be fun to do, I know you had a great conversation recently about the kind of content of the exhibit, but in addition to that, I really wanted to hear about the whole process of how these kind of events come together, because looking through all of the assets you produced as part of this exhibit, it was an extraordinary amount of research. And I know you're working on this for more than a year. So I think it'd be really fun to hear about what did the planning, the research, the funding, like just how do you even start conceiving of something and how does it come together?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I love talking about exhibition design and curation, and that's I think that's what I love to do the most. Obviously, working with the trees is so special, but my background being in museum studies, that was sort of what I went to school for. So yeah, that sounds great. Let me know kind of how you want. Do you want to just structure it as some questions, or just kind of naturally progress through a conversation, or what would work for you?
Natural progression sounds fantastic. I just started getting curious as I was thinking about it. And so I've not been to this exhibit, and Aaron's about to give us a brief overview of this, but I was instantly struck with how much effort went into this. And actually, you had given me an opportunity to start thinking about this, what, a year ago or whenever it was, I was last visiting in the area, and you told me you were working on this. And so it's been kind of kicking around in the back of my head. And so I'll just be curious to know what the process looked like of what it took to got where you are. And then I figured the icing on the cake could be what are your takeaways, or how do you look at trees differently now in light of all this work that you've done?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so when we chatted last year, we were just starting with this idea for our next exhibition, and you know, it's always challenging to finish an exhibition and then immediately feel the pressure to kind of start thinking about what's next, because you're like, I just finished this, and how are you going to do the next one? So there's always that level of enjoyment of having sort of mounted an exhibition, and then also you don't want to quite think about, it's like having a kid. You're not quite ready to think about having the next one right away, but at least in this metaphor, I'm going to have another one, in a couple of years. So the idea came as we were, I've have kind of a standing list of themes and ideas and things I'm interested in exploring that I sort of have always just had, or kind of a running list of exhibit ideas. But I also really like chatting with our staff and kind of brainstorming and getting other people's ideas and suggestions as well. And it was during one of these just kind of informal conversations that you have with coworkers about it, that our museum coordinator, she's like, well, her husband is a big soccer fan, and he had just been talking about the World Cup coming. I actually enjoy watching the World Cup too. I'm a more recent convert into enjoying watching soccer and appreciating that. But it was going to be Seattle area was going to be one of the host cities, and so at the time it sounded like an interesting opportunity to see if we could tap into, because in general, what I like to do for all of my exhibitions is to try to have them feel somewhat relative to sort of current culture, to try to have it connect to something that everyone is either some sort of anniversary. So, for example, the World War Bonsai exhibition was timed to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II.
Mhm.
So even if it's just subtly, like for my own sense, I try to find something that's I can connect it to current culture with, and make it sort of relevant. And so the idea of the World Cup as this metaphor for sport, is a great example of this sort of thing that has a shared set of rules. It's a game that everyone agrees to participate in, and there's sort of this general consensus about what it is and how it's going to be engaged with. But ultimately, too, you can see um, how, at least in the World Cup, there's the countries sort of have this sense of national identity, tied to the team. So, in other, I would say maybe more so outside of the U.S., we're maybe not as tuned into that, but I think we can relate to it with other sporting equivalents. But like the World Cup is kind of the biggest sporting event on the planet, and people's
Yeah.
country winning it is considered to be like the epitome of sport accomplishment, even more so than like Olympic gold medals are. And so there's a sense of national identity tied to these national teams, as well as sort of the way that a lot of these teams are sort of talked about, or even maybe um, the styles of play that they have, the formations they have. There's a little bit of cultural influence. They'll talk about Brazilian players, or the Brazilian team kind of has this very more fluid sort of form of play that kind of maybe evokes more of a sense of dancing versus maybe more of a stricter German formation, which is much more kind of tight and disciplined. And there's a little bit, you can kind of see some of the influence of culture bleeding into how these soccer teams perform. And so that was just really this interesting idea of like, well, we can see that in bonsai, at least when we look at Japanese and Chinese trees, we can see that aesthetically they don't look the same, even though they are sort of approaching this art form of miniaturizing trees and having them be sort of representations or artistic representations of nature. But ultimately though, they're not pursuing the same aesthetic goals. And I think that's part of that influence is culture. And so the idea was, well, does that exist outside of the obvious China,
Mhm.
Japan examples? Could you look at trees from Australia or Spain or France or Canada, and could you see some initially aesthetic markers that might denote a tree from, England versus the Netherlands? And so that was kind of my starting point, and wanting to ask professionals, and people who were at a very high level of the art form, kind of again like a World Cup team. When you think of the players on these teams, they're kind of the household names, the Messis and the Ronaldos and the Mbappes. These are the superstars of the sport as well. And so it's like kind of wanted to see if I could talk to some of the equivalent levels of bonsai professionals, people who have been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years, that if you're in bonsai, you've heard of Kimura or, Luis Vallejo, or, just these very kind of prominent figures in the bonsai community. Because I figured you kind of need a level of involvement to have some perspective to kind of think about culture. If you're just kind of starting bonsai, you might not be right in the metaphysical, esoteric thoughts of bonsai, right? You're more just trying to figure out the practice. But after you've been doing it for
Yeah.
30 years, you kind of have thought about this enough to maybe have an idea or perspective on it. So it was really trying to have some credibility to the interviewers, name recognition, and that sort of longevity, and people who've contributed in a sort of definitive way to kind of the global practice of bonsai, at least as a starting point, for kind of where those conversations started.
I kind of love the way you looked at what essentially is a headline in the sporting world and thought, how can we conceive of how bonsai is practiced around the world just as a result of finding out that the World Cup's happening and coming to town? That's kind of fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I love the challenge for me is that is like it's kind of like a display, right? It's like you have these pieces or these components, and it's like the creativity is in how you can combine them in ways to evoke a story or a narrative.
Mhm.
And so with the exhibitions at PBM, the question for me is always how can I take bonsai, our collection, right, those elements, and present them in a different way, and making it relevant too, because again it
Right.
has to, I think if you can't show bonsai's relevance to people today, at least for me, like that seems to be the most important way to sort of be like, hey, bonsai can connect to culture and to sport and to history and to all these things. It's the excitement of figuring out how to make those connections is really what I get the most enjoyment of.
Clearly, as your history of exhibits has demonstrated over the years, you're kind of giving us all a blueprint for, hey, look, this is what we can do with the stories that our collections of trees can be telling. So, from this starting point of inspiration, what is the very first step you take to start to turn it into something? Like, do you share
Yeah.
this around the office? Do you doodle or noodle on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I thought about how am I going to do this? And um, this idea of my undergraduate degree is in cultural anthropology, which is what led me into the museum profession. And so I was like, well, I can't do a quantitative survey. How, I mean, I was trying to approach this with some level of scientific inquiry as much as I could. There's a lot of holes you can poke into my effort in this, but it's at least a first attempt to do this in a way. And so so I started thinking about who I wanted to speak to and sort of perform more of like a qualitative oral interview, self-reporting. One of the things that I really wanted to make sure was that it wasn't my own removed interpretation or sort of
Mhm.
voice of like, this is what I think Spanish bonsai is, or so I wanted to go as close to the source of having someone from who's been practicing within their own culture and country for so long to be like, this is what it means to me, or this is how I think about it. In many of the interviews, though, a lot of people were like, I've never thought about this idea of like how culture is shaping my work. And so I thought that was really interesting to have a lot of people who I might have assumed had thought about this at some point
Right.
kind of be primed to think about it in this new way. And so I wanted to kind of just start with names of people that I like I had mentioned that had that sort of that history of contribution, and also that I maybe had a personal relationship with. I've met, you've met people through your travels, and you kind of have existing personal relationships with people, like Walter Paul or someone like you're like, oh, I could probably call up this person and they would be willing to chat with me for an hour about it. And so I just sort of started reaching out and sending emails to people. I also wanted to had to kind of first determine what countries that we were going to focus on. That was the other thing, because that was also going to kind of narrow in on who I was going to be talking to. And so one of the first starting point was looking at our own collection of what trees do we have in our collection that are at least imported from some of the countries. So thankfully, we have a fairly geographically diverse country with Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea, um, and then the U.S. and Canada having trees from at
Mm.
least a handful of countries, specifically the Asian countries. Korean, and to have trees from Korea and Taiwan is a little bit more unique, I think, in the States. A lot
Yeah.
of Japanese and Chinese imports, understandably, but that's kind of been a unique thing that the collection has had for a while. These sort of other Asian countries, and so including those were kind of obvious. And then I thought Europe also has a number of professionals that that I was aware of that kind of have, these longer established traditions of bonsai. And then trying to also, though, represent what was kind of interesting, kind of the countries that we were focusing on also have a history of being in the World Cup tournament. So kind of Spain, China, Japan, these sort of Italy, France, Netherlands. So kind of when you think of the World Cup, I was sort of drawing on and looking at the sort of breakdown. I sort of looked at how many which countries have had the most appearances in the World Cup sort of finals tournament, and which was kind of interesting. There seemed to be a little bit of a correlation between the countries that we sort of think of as sort of having very robust bonsai communities, and also being pretty well represented in the World Cup as well. And so while I was trying to have it be representative as much as I could, we have Brazil and Mexico. It was I was really interested in learning more about European bonsai because that's not an area I know a ton about. I know a little bit about it. I would feel I knew more about the U.S. and Japan, obviously, but Europe was kind of became, especially with the soccer connection, much more of a concentration of focus, and we can talk about that as well. And then also just you know the limitation of our space and time. I wanted to at least try to have Mexico and another South American country, specifically Brazil, because they're so popular in the World Cup. But obviously there's gaps in there's no African countries represented in the exhibition, and like I said, there's only two kind of Central and South American countries. So, like I said, it's not meant to be a all inclusive sort of statement as like these are the countries that matter. It was more of a this is looking at my collection that I have access to species wise, existing relationships that I might have, and then also kind of the countries that you might associate more with World Cup play kind of led me down that pathway. And so, we kind of were very specific in the in the introduction of the exhibition, excuse me, to sort of delineate like this isn't meant to be the kind of the sort of statement of these countries are more important than others, or the ones that were left out are not valuable, or the people that were interviewed are more important. It was just more of a limitation of, this was a year-long project, and this is, you know, I could have spent, 5 years trying to work on this to really do a whole, do a much more broader look at it. But given the limitations that we have, there's obviously choices that have to be made of
Yeah.
what you can do and with who. So yeah, it's not meant to be kind of the end of us. It's not like the period. It's not the end of the sentence. It's more of the beginning of like a hopefully sparking a broader discussion about this idea going forward.
Yeah, it's a really natural starting point. A, what are the trees in the collection right now? And B, what access do you have within a given time frame, access to
Mhm.
talk to these people or learn about the practice in their regards? And so when you're putting all this together in the back of your head, you're thinking, okay, when do I want this exhibit to be live? How are we going to do that? I'm sure from a practical perspective, are you just totally free to kind of decide your scope and the timing of all of this as curator? And then you just kind of inform the organization, hey, this is going to be next year's exciting thing?
Yeah, like I said, I start getting input from the staff earlier because this exhibition does guide basically the museum's focus, our messaging, our programs, our docents. It really serves as it sort of defines our focus for the next few years. And so I do thankfully have creative freedom, which was a huge draw for PBM initially when I moved out there 11 years ago, was to be able to make those choices, and to also though have it sort of you know have staff input and giving them things, and then they take it and sort of run so the run into the docent programming or field trips or special things like that. And so everyone's really so creative that they can also kind of take what I come up with and run with it in their own specific areas. But also the our World Bonsai Day, Bonsai Festival that we
Hmm.
have that first weekend in May is really our is the when we typically open exhibitions. And so that's always kind of the date that we use for when an exhibition is going to open. We've played around with it over the years for having it earlier, but really it's not until May, early May, that we tend to target that and couple that with our festival. World Bonsai Day is a big kind of new exhibition, new trees, new content, things like that. And so working back from that data, like, okay, it's got to be up there. We kind of, like I said, we've done enough now to we kind of know the general flow of like, okay, we need, printing to be done by this date. So that means we need to have the design done by this date, which means the content needs to be written by this. And so we just sort of work backwards. And so typically by February, I need to have my final draft is almost needs to be done. And then March, we do our in our design work. We have a volunteer, one of our board members, who's a fantastic graphic designer.
Mm.
And so he's once he kind of got involved with the museum a few years ago, I think 3 or 4 years at this point. He is fantastic, and we had a very similar kind of aesthetic preference. So I kind of have an idea of kind of the visual themes that I like, and so again, going back to the well of soccer, this kind of 1970s kind of vintage um, international soccer style with you can kind of look up the Pumas with and
Mhm.
the kind of very simple like the Mexico. There's a really cool Mexico World Cup poster from 1970. So just very bright graphics, flat, kind of bold, geometric kind of tones and styles was kind of what we were looking. And then I kind of give him the like a mood board, and then he kind of comes back and we massage it a little bit. But so that's kind of where all of the visuals come from. And then Catherine Wimble Fox, our communications director, her and I work together. She's a fantastic editor and writer in her own right, and will I'll sort of write it and provide a rough draft, and she'll give me notes and edits, and her and I work together on the sort of the written component, and then John Mork, our designer, and I work on the graphics, and then the layout, and then we get it printed and installed, and everyone's involved. The bonsai team helps with all of the tree prep and installation and moving things. And the other component of the design too was as we sort of started talking about bonsai is basically a cultural an expression of how a culture sees nature, or sort of how different cultures interact with nature, because the idea of the exhibition really was looking at kind of like nature and nurture, right? We have the environment that gives us our sort of sense of what nature is, right? Where we live strongly influences that, as well as the cultural identity that we grow up in. Those two sort of forces shape people, right? Where we're from and kind of how we grow up. And then you can sort of look at bonsai as the same thing, to where you have, the natural environment that people are using for their reference, not just from a design standpoint, but one of the things that was really interesting is how much environment shapes the techniques and the care that has to be done. And that then gives that those techniques give rise to aesthetics, right? And so it's like the environment shapes how you care for a tree, that shapes how the tree looks. And so you can almost see that kind of that influence as well. And so the bonsai really is kind of this distillation of how a person sort of relates to nature, but ultimately it's how their also culture relates to nature. And that was some things that came through in the conversations was really, the limitation being like I only was able to interview a couple people from each country. When I was lucky, I got 3 people because I wanted that third person to kind of be a comparison, right? But even within talking to a few people, you started to hear similar themes or similar, you know, um, just things that were being talked about. Kind of were crossing over between people from Korea or Taiwan. Like it wasn't something I was necessarily trying to elicit. It was just the questions that were being asked. There were kind of patterns or shared themes that kind of just emerged organically.
And so, what's one example that came up that was either fun or surprising where You talked about you find that within a given geographic region, you're going to have certain environmental factors and certain species which are going to affect the way trees naturally grow or the characteristics they take on. And then the techniques that arise as we try to work on or create representations of these environmental factors in the bonsai world. And so, were there any of those kind of things come up that kind of surprised you or thought, oh, I'd never thought about that before?
Yeah, I mean, I want to use different examples because I feel like a couple of them are pretty strong, but one I haven't really talked about too much in depth, but I thought was really fascinating was looking at trees from England and I was specifically distinguished between England and the UK and Great Britain and all of that because, Ireland is not the same as England, as Wales, as Scotland, right? Those are all different
Yeah.
environments. And so, even in just talking to that, so I was only talking to people who are on kind of the main island of England, right? And so it pertains to them. But a few things that came across in the conversations, I was able to speak with three people from England, and it's such a long inhabited landscape. The environment has been inhabited by people for so long that what I heard was there's very little left that's sort of been untouched by human activity, right? Maybe here in the US, we have lots of wilderness still, and the national parks are kind of set apart as these spaces that are untouched. But for the UK as being an island and also that long engagement with human activity, a lot of it has been manipulated, and so there's not a lot of wild spaces that we would might think of that are producing yamadori is kind of where we're going with this. And so the yamadori that tends to be collected comes out of uh, uh, hedgerows. As
Hmm.
one source for old material in England is hedgerows, which again speaks to that human activity. Those were all planted. Those are defining boundaries, within property lines, things like that. Those are sort of artificial plantings that have been there for hundreds of years. And so you may have a very heavy trunk of a yew or a privet or something like that. But it's so straight, there's not a lot of movement in it. And so the technique then of we think of the UK is having a lot of really great carvers, wood carvers, from Will Badley, Graham Potter, Kevin Wilson. Like some of the earliest, at least from I remember when I started learning about European bonsai, it seemed like the best uh, trunk carvers, dead wood carvers were British were from England. And it was like, and then once I started listening to how they were describing it, it's like, oh, well, you have this material, you have to sort of you have to carve it because that's the way you're going to inject movement or age or some sort of visual characteristics in this very otherwise columnar shaped trunk, right? And so it makes sense that you would need to be a better wood carver, and more UK trees tend to be carved just as much as the species they grow, like yew and beech, these really older trees as they age, they sort of naturally hollow out. And so your references for what an old tree looks like in England might be a hollowed yew tree. If you've seen some of those yews next to churchyards, they're just totally hollowed out. So it's not just the technique is responding to the material because you need to carve it to have that sort of that visual interest added. It's also drawing inspiration from the natural trees themselves. They develop a hollow trunk over time themselves. So it's again, it's kind of that nature nurture thing of the environment's influencing. Seeing all these hollow trunk trees, the material that we have access to requires us to sort of carve them, and so it makes sense for that aesthetic to kind of emerge within that region.
Yeah, it's interesting when we think of it in terms of the trees in our own backyard. As you mentioned, we the imagination immediately goes to wilderness areas, whether, extreme up
Mhm.
at tree line or in the desert or in, coastal, whatever influence we
Mhm.
happen to be pointing to.
Mhm.
Whereas if the entire landscape has been, if not tamed, at least colonized over a lot of years, we
Mhm.
still have examples of trees that gain great aging character and develop the characteristics that we look for. And so, while they may not be trying to reproduce through carving the effects of nature in wilderness. It might be the effects of nature on old tenacious trees that are clinging to their existence for whatever reason. I never
Hmm.
thought about it in that kind of a setting because it's the same factor, but resulting from a very different experience from the tree's perspective.
Yeah, and that was kind of the really one of the major takeaways was just really seeing that connection between the environment and the aesthetics. And so for another example was, in Mexico, sort of helping to understand the, the challenges of cultivating trees in more extreme climates, right? Whether it's Canada, where there's so much cold all the time, where you need to sort of rely on some level of winter care, or in Mexico, where it's much hotter, and so the standards of aesthetics is is also varied because the challenges of just growing a bonsai are different globally, and so then you can't have like the same you can't apply a Japanese standard of care or form or quality or however we want to sort of phrase that blankly because the environments that people are growing in are not like Japan, and so if most of the northern hemisphere, Europe and the US and Japan, majority of the world's populations live in that kind of temperate band. But when you go south of the equator or as you approach the equator, the challenges of cultivating potted plants are very different. I was speaking to Hugo Zamora from Mexico, and he was just saying how you can have it be very hot one day and then very cold the next day. You can have these very dramatic swings within the temperature, and so you have to be much more tuned into the quickness that the environment, the weather changes. We can sort of have a little bit of that here, but it more or less follows some consistent pattern to where just then the standard of beauty isn't some sort of Japanese standard. It's more the fact that like you have a tree that you've taken care of that's alive for 20 years. Like that's more of the fact that
Mhm.
it's alive is really the badge of honor because that in of itself is an accomplishment. It's not that you're sort of then arbitrarily applying this. Well, it doesn't look like this. It's like, oh, it doesn't look good. It's like, well, no, dude. Like the fact that it's there at all is like that's a really you know important sort of comment on how attuned that person is to caring for their tree. It's not as easy as maybe it is elsewhere. Um,
Yeah, let's
so
celebrate that.
yeah, this what constitutes sort of good bonsai is not a universal sort of thing. And so I think that was one thing I took away is like when I see trees from other countries, having a little bit of awareness of just like I can't just apply my own standard of beauty, which again like that varies from culture to culture. What we think is beautiful is going to be different from what someone else is, and I think there's more of a tendency probably for that in bonsai to always be referencing Japan as kind of that epitome of quality, which obviously they are, but at the same time, um, the environments are so diverse across the globe that you just can't have that because you're really
Mhm.
because the environment shapes your tree so much, you just can't disassociate that.
And so, what characteristics would you think to look for now when looking at the work from a Mexican artist, for instance?
Well, yeah, I think it also depends on the species, right? That's a huge
Yep.
factor of what's going to grow well. And so, obviously, tropical trees are the ability for uh, countries that are closer to uh, the tropics or warmer climates really have an advantage over temperate climates because they can grow much more. They can grow faster, so they can develop things much more quicker and utilize that. Unlike us, who have more kind of traditional seasons, we kind of are relegated to the a limited growing season where you can see, like in the Philippines or in Taiwan, the ability to develop a really dense, rapid ramification. Those really highly refined trees where they almost are pure, just ramification. They'll defoliate trees to showcase that it's not even about the foliage. It's like
Mhm.
how dense is the twigging. So for same thing for Mexico is like they have the ability to really leverage the tropical climate and use trees for that. So those that material is kind of, again, just if you see something that is like really well refined, uh, in Mexico, or something that has a level of maturity, that's even more of something to kind of celebrate, of just like, oh my gosh, wow, that's. And then, and we could also talk about too, just access to materials around the globe too. Like, thankfully through you, like akadama now is something that's a little bit easier to access. But that doesn't mean everyone around the planet has access to akadama, or that akadama actually is the right material.
That's
In
right.
Brazil, that was one of the thing that was really interesting, was akadama does not work in Brazil because it breaks down too quick. It holds too much moisture, and so they had to kind of develop their own growing medium, which basically is a roof tile, some sort of hard fired roofing tile that then is pulverized, broken down into the proper grades, and that's what's used as their growing medium. And there's this kind of there's a saying in Brazil. I can't remember the exact pronunciation in Spanish, but or in Portuguese, but it's basically this spirit of adaptation is kind of this ability of sort of using what you have available to you, is kind of a cultural value in Brazil. And so I saw that as a really interesting connecting, uh, a connection of like, oh, there's this spirit of kind of uh, self-reliance and sort of making use with what you have. And here they are taking roofing tiles, and that's what they're using. They've figured out that's a good substrate for growing bonsai, right? And so so even just that, when we sort of talk about like the boon mix, or the pumice lava, it's like, yeah, that might work in a lot of regions, but it doesn't work in all regions, right? So you just can't apply the same techniques to everywhere in the globe. Everyone's having to adapt it, and then finds out what works for them.
Exactly. Now, one of the first things you mentioned is that going into this, you weren't as familiar with the European bonsai scene, and you took this as an opportunity to bone up on that. And so, what takeaways did you get, or did you just have fun exploring a little bit and kind of giving yourself the opportunity to learn about professionals and the work that was coming out of continental Europe?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I've always heard of a lot of these folks by name, and so it was a really great opportunity to have a conversation like we are and hear their thoughts on it. You can definitely tell, and for all of the interviews that we were able to do like this over Zoom, we recorded them and we're slowly releasing them. We just released our conversation with Luis Vallejo, who's super a fascinating individual. And so you can tell when you can definitely tell what people have thought about this, because they
Mm.
have very well um, you know highly thought out answers. And not to say that there's not value in those that didn't, but that was one thing that struck me, was when someone, you could just tell when someone had thought about this prior to being asked about it. So just hearing people's responses to the questions, and really allowing them to also, as a trying to not influence or bias their responses. I was trying to be consistent with my questioning, as much as I could, but there also was the opportunity to kind of cross check. So it's like, oh well, if I heard something, I might ask them about that. What about this? Does this resonate with you, or does this seem like something you would agree with? And they might say yes or no, and that would help be like, okay, yeah, that's correct. Or I might have an idea and be like, it sounds like this, and they'd be like, yes or no. So just that was really great to cross check. But just going back to the European thing, a few things that were really cool was looking at the Netherlands, sort of Dutch bonsai, which again I didn't know much about either. You sort of hear Spain and Italy and Germany, or these sort of more pronounced countries in Europe, but I just didn't know much about the Netherlands from a bonsai perspective. And so, in talking to, I was able to talk to Oscar Juncker from Bonsai Empire, and then I was able to have a written correspondence with Ferrand Block from, uh, bonsai, European bonsai, and then bonsai focus. And so, this idea in talking to Oscar was, he talked about the Netherlands, or the Dutch, as traders. The Dutch were some of the first Europeans to make contact with Japan back in the 1600s. The Portuguese were the very first, and then the Dutch were very closely behind them in sort of the first Europeans to interact with Japan. And he was describing the Netherlands as kind of this that has a very strong culture of like trade and interacting with different countries, right? This sense of trade and sort of going out, bringing things back, and then distributing that, sort of transmitting that culture and sort of seeing that in a way where it was fascinating that both of these individuals have been involved in really promoting bonsai, both on the internet with Bonsai Empire. Oscar's webpage is one of the most visited multilingual sources for information on the internet for pertaining to bonsai. And then Ferran was the editor in chief of Bonsai Europe and then Bonsai Focus. And so you have these two Dutch individuals who are really heavily involved in the transmission of information about bonsai. And it really, I don't know if that's more of it seems too much to be a coincidence, like it could be, but just this idea of this Dutch identity as maybe going out, gathering information, and then kind of then distributing it, just sort of tied into their own roles with their roles within the broader bonsai, sort of global community as these sort of traders of information in a way, or importers as well. There's very little, like England, there's very little unmanaged landscape in Dutch. It's all under sea level, right? The dikes and all the tulip fields, and so like there's a strong connection to horticulture, but it's also heavily managed, right? There's
Right.
no big mountain ranges. I think the Netherlands translates to something. I don't know exactly what it speaks to, like the flatness of their country, right? Netherlands, yeah, I can't remember what it exactly means, but I came across it. It was like, oh, that makes sense because it's all flat. So if you have no mountains creating this dramatic Yamadori that Italy and France might have with the Alps, you've got to import material, and so there's a lot of importation of bonsai material into the Netherlands, and so you're going to see more imported trees versus Yamadori. Or what they even talked about was like trading, which again goes back to them as traders. You can trade your imported material for a mugo pine from Italy, and you're sort of having to use that sort of trade network. So just those things where I didn't really know what I was going to find for a lot of these. That was kind of the exciting thing, was just like I didn't know if this was going to turn into anything. I kind of was like, I hope there's an exhibition in here. Like, I think we could talk about that. But when I started interviewing people, I had no idea what we were going to talk about or what they were going to say. But it was really exciting to start to see those little points of connection start coming up as we progress through the interviews.
Well, that's a super interesting example about the Netherlands. One thing it speaks to is a somewhat universal desire for trees that have a certain look. Because if they're not taking any cues in the Netherlands from anything that would reflect their experience in nature,
Mm.
there's something that still made it desirable enough to start these websites, to start these publications, to start these businesses to satisfy some kind of a demand. And
Mm.
that's cutting across what the cultural influences may bear. Now, how it's practiced there might be different. That would be kind of its own slice of the discussion.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
interesting that there are people that are so interested in something that's kind of similar about these trees around the world, whether or not it speaks to what they may see. It's like you see a picture of these things and it just something clicks.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to this broader, and I think Europe has that a little bit more so, this appreciation for the tradition. That was one thing I heard a lot just in Europe, was valuing the Japanese. There's a strong appreciation for the Japanese
Mhm.
model and aesthetics, right? And this idea of Japan as being held in such high regard for their commitment to the craft and the techniques and the execution of that at a really high level. I heard that a lot in Spain. I heard that a lot in France. These cultures who sort of have, I think they sort of see themselves in the Japanese, right? You sort
Mhm.
of you see what you value, and it's like, oh, we appreciate this level of commitment to a very high standard of execution. And so you when you sort of think about in France, you have this one of the things that came up a lot with or in the French conversations was I spoke with Francois Jerker. He
Mm,
interviewed via email because of just the language barrier, and then JP Horu, he was one of Ryan's early apprentices out
mm,
here, and then he's gone back to France. And so both of them talked about their, oh, I went to college, yeah, I have an arts degree. Like I went to school for art. Both of them were sort of artists, and so there seems to be a really strong emphasis on like the academic legitimacy, like
mm,
academia legitimizing you as a artist or as a professional in the sense of, you know, in France they have this very highly uh, you know, structured educational system. So we can think of like Le Cordon Bleu for a French chef, right? If you're going to be a chef, you want to go and study in France, right? Or Les Beaux Arts, which was an architectural
mm.
school, right? You sort of have your schooling sort of legitimizes you. You're not just an artist that's self-made or self-taught. You've gone to school for it. And so both of them started out with being like, oh, I went to school for art, I went to school for design, like there's this kind of this academic underline that justifies your professionalism. And so the thing that kind of came out through that, which I didn't fully appreciate, was how France has a strongly organized national bonsai association that has this sort of structured progression system in it that they basically accredit you as a teacher at the club level, at the
Mm.
regional level, and then at the national level. And you have to go through their program of training. There's an established curriculum, and you're tested at these various levels, and that means you have qualified to be a judge at a national level, or you are a level 2 qualified instructor, and that means you can teach kind of regionally. And so all of the clubs have agreed, obviously, to ascribe to this system and participate in it. And it's not that everyone does, but there's enough to where, just going on the French Bonsai Association's website, you can see. And that was one thing I was doing in the research. I was trying to like go to these different websites of countries bonsai associations, like read their
Mm.
bylaws, translate their kind of, I went through the whole French's kind of bylaws to really understand how structured and formal it is. And when
Wow.
I discuss it, everyone's like, oh, that sounds like the French. And it's like, yeah, it does, right? There is this kind of cultural mindset of like, you're known for having this very kind of highly codified structure. And what's also really fascinating is, we talk about sort of culture as an influence of culture in the environment. Well, that type of highly structured environment from an artistic standpoint also produces the rebels who push against that structured system, right? And so most of the avant-garde art movements started in France as a rejection of the highly structured, formalistic sort of class of sort of governing artists. The from the um, impressionists starting there, and then we can think of Laurent Derieux, who's also the example of the rebel, the friend, the sort of countercultural or sort of rejectionist of the established system, right? And so you have you so like, does that produce, does one produce the other, right? Without that strong rigid system, then you don't have rebels to push against that system, and sort of they create each other in a way, right? I didn't have a chance to interview Laurent, but I had tried to. But that was, you kind of had this really interesting microcosm representation of the art sort of movement in France within bonsai, of this kind of, avant-garde rebel who's sort of snubbing his nose at the established system, and then the other people who are sort of advocating for this very highly structured, uh, you know, Japanese approach that we don't need to improve upon it. It's already so good. Just do it really well. Like that was also someone else's perspective. They valued that kind of commitment to executing something at a very high level, like the Japanese do. So things like that, just little kind of huh, like that's kind of interesting when you started hearing how people talk. It's like you can see that in other aspects of their culture. It's not just like this one off from bonsai. It's like you see that there, you see that there. I couldn't imagine in the U.S., for example, us having some nationalized association that sort of you have to go through this accreditation process. I know there's been conversations over the years about like, accreditation for professionals, but it's as an American, like there's a part of me that's just like, No, like you can't tell me that I have to do this to be able to do this, right? Like that sort of rubs us the wrong way. That's the whole, the don't tread on me type of spirit of America. It's like, yeah, no, we don't. You can take your your organization and take it. So anyway, it's just interesting how those things kind of naturally appeal to different people and different cultures, and others it's like, no, that wouldn't work here.
Exactly. And actually, on that note of Americanism, say I were doing a similar project and I called you up and said, Aaron, in this crazy diverse country where we have radically different cultures,
Mhm.
radically different environments, what trends or how do you think about the effect of culture on American bonsai?
Yeah, it's so
Or
much
better
easier.
said, maybe bonsai in America.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what's so much fun is being the interviewer, you get to ask the questions, and that's the easy part, right? So having the tables turned on me, yeah, I've thought about that myself. I'm like, ooh, can I? What would I say? And I think, I mean, I added my own perspective too to the exhibition, just uh, as that, obviously having written it, but then I did try to include a little bit of my own perspective in that, in the sense of, I think, and to sort of reference this idea of like culture is not monolithic, right? We know that in the U.S., the U.S. is not a monolithic culture. Regionally, it's not how bonsai is practiced in the Southwest is different than the Northeast, and all over, right? Because there's different environments, different subcultures, etc. But generally, right, I think as the value of being an American is this sense of freedom, the ability to express yourself in a way that is not being curtailed by somebody else saying you have to do it this way, or you have to do it that way, or you have to be accredited. Um, and so I think, at least at the baseline, in some general sense, while we uh, you know, I'm trying to say, hypothetically, we espouse individual freedoms, right? Obviously, our country, we can go in, that's a whole separate conversation about how much that actually exists, or how much it is being eroded. But at the same time, fundamentally, I think we value that sense of individual freedom and creativity. But also at the same time, we do have in the bonsai world this sort of, both the ability for people to be more creative and to create things that are more unique. I keep seeing more and more things online, or just shows where people are experimenting with new elements that maybe it's a formal display structure, but the components that are being used are non-traditional in themselves. But at the same time, there is a strong commitment of, or a strong valuing of the Japanese approach to bonsai. And there are people who like the traditional, three-point display with the proper elements, and them relating to each other, kind of how bonsai is practiced in Japan. So I see that there's more, maybe just plurality of that ability for bonsai to kind of become something very different, but also knowing that there's a lot of people who like to do who like to continue that kind of traditional practice. And so I think making sure both of those can exist, that one's not good or bad. It's just that we're able to have the freedom to choose what we want to do.
Well, it's funny. And there's another side to that coin. What immediately came to mind is yes, we are free. You can't tell me what to do. We can do whatever we want. And in general, we all celebrate that. And yet, our country is also broken up into more and more tribes that feel very strongly
Right.
that anyone outside of their tribe is doing it
Sure.
wrong. And so
Yeah.
I haven't totally
Yeah.
been able to reconcile. We can do whatever we want, but that's only if I'm the one that can do whatever I want. You
Yeah.
definitely should do what I want, or else you're dumb.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. And I think that's a great point. And I think that's kind of what the broader, I hope, takeaway is from the exhibition, the title being Bonsai United was one a play off the whole, you know, soccer name convention of
A lot of
Manchester
United.
United, a lot of United soccer teams out there,
Yeah.
but also this underlying idea of hopefully that regardless of the region or the trees or the reasons why people do bonsai is varied and extremely different. So why you do it is different than how I do it. And so just respecting the fact that we're all like the soccer metaphor, we're all playing the same game, but we're going to play it all a little differently. And but at the end of the day, we all of these people are doing it because we enjoy this connection that we have with nature and the ability to express our culture and our own individuality in such a unique way, and that it does look different from China to Japan to Taiwan and everywhere else. And so there is that sense of unity, or sort of hopefully encouraging us to see to focus more on the commonalities rather than the differences, right? So and I think like you're saying, I think that message is just as relevant today as it ever is, and maybe as needed as it is today than ever before. So yeah, I hope people just at least walk away with kind of, for our visitors who are not bones, maybe some are bonsai insiders, but the general public, they still think of bonsai as a type of a tree. That's our more frequent um, threshold of entry for visitors. So even just to help people understand, like, oh, like there's differences. It's not all this sort of monolithic thing that most people think of as a bonsai. It's like, wow, there's difference, and maybe they are going to see themselves represented in one of the countries. It's like, oh, I'm from this country. Wow, people in my country do bonsai like this. Like I never knew that before, right? And so having so far the our section from Mexico has I've overheard the most enjoyable responses from people, and hearing people speaking Spanish and really kind of reacting positively to seeing that section and the trees there, and just as I'm watering or just walking through, just kind of like, yeah, hearing people speaking Spanish in that alcove is like really enjoyable to have that. So yeah, we're excited to kind of hear what other uh, feedback people have and what responses are yet. So
Yeah, it's funny. The major commonality, what unites us all, is that we care deeply about these trees and what
mhm,
that care may look like in different communities within a country or across different countries might look very different. But
mhm,
it does keep coming back to that tree in some kind of a container that we find
mhm,
to be just fascinating.
mhm,
And what a great benefit to be able to watch people interacting with the exhibits and enjoying that, and then kind of adding that to their stories of their experience of
mhm,
understanding these trees, like you say, whether they're insiders or absolutely new to it because they happen to be in the neighborhood and someone suggested it.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, it's been nice to see that reaction.
And so for those who haven't been to the museum, it'd be fun to know a little bit about the actual facility. And so you have, how many trees are on display as part of this exhibit right now?
Yeah, there's about 55 bonsai
Wow.
on display, and the way that our display is set up as a series of alcoves, either two or three tabletops holding a tree in each one, and it's sort of just a elongated sort of circular path. And one of the things that I also did from an exhibition design standpoint was that I presented the countries in order of how bonsai has progressed culturally over time. And so we you start out in China and as the sort of origin point for bonsai, which that alone most people don't realize, this practice started in, at least we have the earliest evidence it started in China. And then you sort of follow the cultural transmission of bonsai globally from, into Korea, Taiwan, and then into Japan, and then out into the Western world. And so the design, the sort of the physical design of the exhibition is largely sort of mirroring that sort of that cultural transmission through time. So you kind of are following the path that bonsai has taken as an art form throughout the world.
It's and as you go through these alcoves, for those who haven't been, there are these posters that Aaron mentioned that have graphics that kind of tie it all together. So you know precisely where you are in the exhibit, what the
Mhm.
point of the given trees you're looking at happens to be. But then there's all kinds of text that will kind of get at what is kind of at issue that is being shared at the time. Now, is the text on the posters the same that's on the website in the app where it goes through the what is the environment like in a country? What is the culture like? And then how is this translated into bonsai, those kind of three-section format?
Yeah, absolutely. That was kind of how for as a writer, you want to try to figure out a consistent formula for presenting information in a way that is systematic so people can at least anticipate what it's going to be. But also the challenges of writing and trying to condense these ideas into a very small word count, and also being able to convey it in a way where people are going to read it. It's clear, and it's again reducing some very big ideas into a small footprint. Um, the three, yeah, as you mentioned, three main sections were sort of environment, culture, and expression, and I thought it was important to sort of help frame the some of the distinct environmental features that I heard being described, and then this idea of a cultural anchor, something that we kind of could point to as that is sort of known in general knowledge, or maybe not, something that might help to frame one of the things that you see, um, you know, represented in these cultures. Like one kind of interesting concept that I didn't quite include, but it was one I was playing around with for the Italian section. Is there's this term in Italian that basically conveys this idea of kind of of like casual excellence, I guess is the word. It's called sprezzatura. I don't know if you've ever heard that
Hmm.
word, but if you Google it, you'll see a bunch of sort of older Italian men wearing very nice clothes, but it's kind of like a casual elegance where, like, like the tie's undone, and like the shirt's unbuttoned, and the pocket square is a little ruffled, or the sleeves are kind of rolled up. And so it's this idea of doing something that's very like a high quality, but making it look easy, right? And so it's this really like sense of like, oh yeah, it's kind of casual. We just kind of threw it together, but no, it's like you only can do that because you really have a high level of like, high taste in fashion to pull off this kind of sprezzatura look, right? It's like you just kind of threw it on, but you're so well, you know, done up that you just like you look really, really good. And so that kind of was one of the cultural anchors I had heard coming across in some of the conversations. We went with, I think, a different direction, but that's just one of them where you're like, oh, there's this word in Italy, and it means this kind of like it means this thing that relates to fashion, but it's doing something really well and making it look easy, right? And so you could argue that's one of the ways that the Italians approach their bonsai is they have a very high commitment to technique, but the technique is not the end point. It's the technique that allows you to do
That's
the
right.
artistic expression, but you're so good, you have such a high technique that it looks like easy. Like it doesn't look overworked. It's not highly, like it's just right where you're like, wow, that's really good. And it looks like they just kind of did it, right? It's like, oh yeah, I just threw this on, and but you do it in a way you're like, you look really good.
Yeah, something I have no personal reference for whatsoever, but
Yeah, me neither.
but yeah, it's so great. So much in bonsai is I keep coming back to the phrase simple but not easy. And when you have that
Yeah.
high level of technique and that high level of execution, then you can make things look really easy, and that can convey whatever the artistic sense the artist happens to be looking to express.
Yeah, yeah, and just to continue the conversation on the content, so those are the three main elements. A few sections, because of their significance to bonsai history, specifically China and Japan, have multiple sections,
Mhm.
and where we kind of lay a little bit more groundwork to kind of tease out a little bit more of like the esoteric philosophies behind Chinese landscape painting, or some of the um, more spiritual elements of Taoism, or Shintoism in Japan, that kind of really set the groundwork, because a lot of most Western countries, or the countries that started doing bonsai post World War II really still do, we still consider Japan as that reference point. And so the values that you sort of see represented in the Japanese approach to bonsai, you see that, influencing bonsai in the West, and also and vice versa. I mean, in Korea and Taiwan as well. Like it's not a, at least at this point right now we can see that cross-cultural reference to where Japan is now, influencing China, and China is now influencing Taiwan. And, it's you can sort of start to see those back and forth happening a little bit more, but making sure that there was enough space to really give to representing like the Japanese mindset or the approach, because it really would help inform a lot of the other questions or the other countries. And then we also provided a few kind of tidbits of information for depending on how much you wanted to read. Some sort of theme words that kind of helped prime people. If you didn't want to read all of it, you could sort of read a couple words that kind of just evoke the sense of what was being discussed, or the values that sort of were encapsulating these. Sort of like a quick kind of crib sheet, if you will, for that. And then we pulled some of the quotes from our interviews and have those on a sort of the lower tiered information, so that those are reinforcing the themes and the information. If you were to read it all, you sort of have the quotes from interviews that are sort of justifying the interpretation that I was doing. Wanting to make sure it's not just my understanding or what
Mhm.
I think. It's coming from these individuals, and who and a little bit of a bio on them, like who they are, how long they've been doing it, and then kind of a quote that kind of helps to reinforce the content.
And I think what's great and helps people connect is that it's not just, as you said, this esoteric philosophical approach to all of this. You provide those underpinnings for those who are interested, but the entire thing is grounded by these wonderful audio segments that are
Mhm.
incredibly concrete and incredibly down to earth. And so that be for people who are kind of following along as they go through the exhibit on the app, or if they want to follow up after the fact or beforehand and catch the video that way.
Yeah, we've really started utilizing an app called Bloomberg Connects. It's a free app for museums and nonprofits to utilize, and it's been a really great tool that is, I think that's I would say the next step up in our kind of exhibition, uh, you know, we're leveling up our exhibition game in a sense of having these audio components that we've never had. We've had some audio tours, I don't want to say that, but really integrating it much more intentionally with an exhibition in this way, that really adds the feeling like if you were going to go to you know the San Francisco museum, SF MoMA or something like that. If you went into another art museum and you would sort of expect to see the audio tour features within an exhibition, we're just continuing to add these elements that, again, kind of level up our exhibition game. This is also the first time that we've used the entire display space. We normally have a major exhibition and then a smaller special exhibition,
Mhm.
but due to the size of this exhibition and the scope of it, I'm using the entirety of it, which is another first for us. So that was really kind of exciting to have the size of our exhibition just is increasing to need all of our tables, that we're not sort of dividing them up between two different exhibitions. It's one really big one.
Wow, that's pretty huge because I know you do always have, there's always like the bonus smaller thing after whatever the
Right,
main exhibit is, you get to the end and
right,
oh, and now we're doing, here's some natives or here's some this or that,
right,
whatever the
right,
story
right.
is.
Yeah, but
That's
no,
so
we
cool.
needed all the tables for
Wow.
every alcove needed its own section. So yeah, it was a big one.
And so what's funny is one of the most exciting things you said was right near the beginning, you'd mentioned how great the contributions were from your entire team and how much freedom you have to do this is. I don't know that people who aren't familiar with the workings of a garden have any way to process the extraordinary number of hours that go into planning like this. This was probably a
Mhm.
near full-time effort for multiple people for months.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
know
I
you've
mean,
got day-to-day responsibilities, but I know that a lot of people are chipping away at this for a long period of time. And it's just so great for the community to be able to benefit from having this. And it's also an awesome model that if anyone wants to pursue a tiny bit of this, whether in their own collection or in a garden that they manage, it's, I think it's just one of the neatest things about it is that you're able to pull off stuff like this, exhibit after exhibit that's as inspiring as they are.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, like I said, I mean, we know like any exhibition, it's a team effort, and I'm really grateful. Everyone at PBM, we're so blessed to have such a great group of people, and they're so multifaceted. Like you're not just doing one thing, as you mentioned, right? If people who can write can also design, who can also take photography, who can it's we all wear a number of hats, and so um, and everyone's so supportive too. I think because it'd be one thing if people someone wasn't on board, but we all kind of have such a strong team mindset that everyone gets on board right away and is really excited about it, and we all are pulling in the same direction, and that really allows us then to do a lot with a very small but highly talented staff. And we rely on volunteers too. I can't say enough about our graphic designer, John Mork, who just is world class designer. And without him, I think too, like our exhibitions visually, while they've been cool over the years, they continue to get better. And once he came on and donates his graphic design talent, it's just it's next level. So yeah,
Did John do the
everybody.
posters for the kids exhibit last year?
Yeah, so last year John did the yeah, he's worked on, I'm trying to remember when he came on board. I think it was after bonsai or World War Bonsai exhibition, but he did our avant garden exhibition.
Uh,
He helped with small talk, but he brought in a colleague of his who drew all of the smaller characters. So he even
uh,
has graphic design friends and colleagues that he will kind of convinced to help him out in some ways. And so that was a colleague who drew all the little characters, but no, he then did the layout and the major treatments of all of our Bonsai United content. And so yeah, it's so cool to have professionals helping for a variety of different things, because I can kind of know what I want it to look like, but
right.
I don't have the expertise to design what he can. And so you got to know when to outsource the creative elements to people who do it better than you do.
Yeah, for small talk, it really stuck out to me that, like, okay, this is just a level beyond what you expect even from museums, like at any level of
Mm.
museum. It was beautiful, it was fun, it was informational, it was just top to bottom. It was just a really, really well executed event. And just how fun would it be? Because the kind of hilarious butt of the joke is, even though it's aimed at youths enjoying
Mhm.
bonsai, is speaking to children's a great way to approach speaking to adults who don't know the
Sure,
first thing about bonsai. It just happens to
sure.
work out really well. Oh, look, it's fun, it's friendly.
Right, right. Yeah, and it goes back to the idea of making bonsai accessible. And I think that's if you can do that, if you can put away the jargon and put away it has to be talked about in a certain way, or you have to, you know, yeah, it's what's your goal is. Is your goal to sort of show someone how much you know about it, or are you actually trying to help them understand it, right? And so as a museum, we really are trying to just provide as many points of entry for people to appreciate bonsai, because we know not everyone's going to do bonsai, and if we can get everyone to start appreciate it and see its value, then that's a win in our book.
And on that note, what are the best ways for people to engage with this exhibit, whether in person or online?
Yeah, I mean, I would love people to come and see it. It'll be up until the end of 2027. So it'll be up for the next year and a half. So if you are in the area, please come and visit it. But like you said, we do have some great resources through our Bloomberg app. And there you can read all of the content in the exhibition is there. You can listen to some of the shorter excerpts. We're going to be having, again, we're going to be releasing all of the recorded interviews in their entirety on the museum's YouTube channel, kind of over the summer, and just staying connected through social media and things like that for what's coming up, just in general from the day to day. But yeah, there's a few ways of engaging with it. We'd like to maybe do exhibition guide down the road, do some sort of
Mm.
printed kind of consolidated all this information into a little pamphlet or booklet. But yeah, the Bloomberg app is great, unless you can't make it to the museum. So yeah, a lot of different ways to connect.
And I'd like to put a bug in people's ears. On multiple occasions, I've actually flown up for exhibits just as day trips. And I remember I did
Mm-hmm.
that. I forget which exhibit it was, but I actually flew up to the museum just to see one of the
Oh,
exhibits. It might have been the
wonderful.
one with featuring Michael and Ryan's work. And I
Yeah,
remember I
yeah.
literally flew up for the day,
Oh,
went to the
wonderful.
museum in the morning, I think went to Landing Gardens in the afternoon, then flew back home that afternoon. And I've since done multiple trips like that. And so it's actually accessible from a pretty big chunk of the US as a day trip, let alone if, God forbid you want to spend a few days in the gorgeous Pacific Northwest. This time of year is about as good as it gets.
Yeah, yeah. I just had a nice conversation with the person who was going to be working with Andrew this last weekend, and they, added a trip to the museum because they came
Nice.
in, a day early, and so yeah, for people who are traveling to Portland for study, a lot of people do that. We're only about three and a half hours from Portland, so it's a pretty quick, like you said, day trip, or fly in or out of Seattle and fly out of Portland. So there's a lot of easier ways to get it. If you're kind of close by, you can pop up and check it out. So
Yeah, you're what, a
um,
whopping 10 minutes from the airport,
yeah, very
if
close.
that.
And
Yeah.
we've just added light rail to the city. Has a light rail that people can take from Seattle itself. So yeah, more and more ways to get to the museum.
Well, that's awesome. And what's the best way for people to follow along with just what's going on at the museum in general?
Yeah, I mean, I would say our social media, Instagram, Facebook, we're on TikTok now, at Pacific Bonsai Museum, and then our website is pacificbonsaimuseum.org. And if they want to sign up for any of our mailing lists or things like that, they'll get more up-to-date information. But just through social media and resharing and supporting us that way would be awesome.
That sounds fantastic. Any parting words from the museum to the world?
Yeah, well, we just are so grateful for the support that we do receive from all of the people who do support us in whatever way that is, whether it's like you and helping us talk about what we're doing, or people who are financially supporting us through donations or memberships. You know, the work that we get to do, we try to, we're not just doing it for ourselves. We hopefully that it's adding to the perceived value of bonsai globally. And I feel like this is also, this exhibition in particular is coming at the right time to really encourage us to all look at the things we share in common, and celebrate our differences, while also understanding like we all enjoy little trees and pots, that crosses cultures, and so that's something that we can all celebrate.
Well said. Thanks so much.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jonas.
The music on today's podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Blue Dot Sessions. Check them out at www.sessions.blue.